For me, I've always found it interesting that when I've come to certain places around the world, people in the church will call me brother. And I think I've always liked that element of a sibling relationship with people in the church, because for me, we're all in this together. It's about all of us doing what we can, responding to our discipleship. I am from Melbourne, Australia. I grew up in the Hughesdale congregation. So I grew up in the church. Mum and Dad, we went to church pretty much every Sunday. It was a big part of our lives. I think for me, I realised probably in my teen years, the church was the place where I truly felt like I was myself. I think in other areas of my life, I was someone that was slightly different or not quite who I truly was. And so I recognised that when I was at camp or when I was in the congregation, that's when I could truly be myself. There was a period where I wasn't attending as frequently, sort of through my university years, where things had come up on the weekend or I had part-time work and things like that. But I remember a specific experience where I went back to the congregation just out of circumstance, because I didn't happen to have anything on that Sunday. It had probably been maybe 3 or 4 months since I'd been there. And it hit me in that moment. And it was a realization that said to me, this is what's been missing in your life in the last few months. It wasn't long after that I was called to the office of priest. There's a moment in time where it's hard to describe, but it's like a thought that comes into my mind that's an external thought. I know it's not my own thought, but any call that I've ever had comes as an external thought. Instantly, my reaction is always to argue against that thought and to say, that's ridiculous. There is no way that that is what I'm being called to. But yet, that continues to persist. And so for this role, I was asked to go into Stacey's office to have a chat, but there was still that thought that came that said, she's going to ask you to take a role as an apostle. Of course, I argued against that. The experience I had as I left the temple that day, it was late in the evening and I walked out and the sun was starting to set. And the sky was just this bright pink and orange as the sun was setting, reflecting on the clouds. And being Australian and loving the ocean, I remember the thought running through my head, red sky at night, sailor's delight. And I sort of laughed at myself and said, this is anything but delightful. And so then the next morning, the sky again was lit up with colour as the sun was starting to rise, and it was a bright orange and pink and yellow. And again, I remember the saying that came to me was, red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. And I remember thinking, that's much more like it. That feels much more appropriate for this role. But then the thought came, and it was really clear and really precise. And it was taken from the book of Mark in chapter 4, in verse 40, where it says, why are you so afraid? And it hit me in that moment. Just recognizing that, why am I so afraid? If this is God calling me, then maybe I do need to step forward in faith. I remember sitting across the table at a cafe, and it was with a family that the mum was there with her kids and her dad. And as I sat across the table, he said to me, what is the one thing that differentiates the community of Christ from any other Christian faith out there? I stopped and thought about it for a moment, and I was smart enough to keep my mouth shut. And then he said, continuing revelation. And I think that's really stuck with me because that has been such an important part of my experience. Whether it is the way we understand continuing revelation and how the Doctrine and Covenants is brought before the church, that it's not simply one person dictating to us where God is calling us, but there's a collective sense of discussion and encouragement and decision making in that process. Whether it's the personal experiences we have, the moments of Zion that we create in different experiences around the world, but the way that we understand how God is continuing to move and work in the world, but to also be open and guided by that. I think that's really critical for me as we consider what it is to be a community of Christ throughout the world. And so I think that is our greatest opportunity, is to engage in the sacred so that we can get a sense of where God is calling us to then go and make a difference in the world.